Good morning, first of all, to you. I wanted to just, I guess, first of all, for our audience, for us to introduce yourself. That way they have a better idea of who you are. Of course, many documentaries and decades of films and documentaries, but just for our audience who may not know who you are, if you could give us a brief introduction.
Well, hello, my name's David Fairhead. I'm a film editor and film director, and I'm the co-director of Spitfire, which is a film that came out in 2018.
Awesome. And in terms of a few of the more intriguing and interesting questions that we have, of course, Aviate is a aviation-inspired brand. We've got a lot of focus on historical events and people within aviation history. So the Spitfire has got a lengthy history, and I think has altered the course of history on its own. So what made you decide on the Spitfire at that time when you were looking at producing documentaries? And of course you've got an extensive list of different documentaries, but what made you choose the Spitfire?
Well, I have to give the credit to my co-director on this, Ant Palmer. And Ant and I had worked together 20 years before. He was director and I was an editor on a TV series here in the UK, and we'd always stayed in touch, although we'd never managed to work together again. And he knew that I'd gone from working in TV to working in feature documentaries, which are documentaries that are made for the cinema. And he decided that he wanted to have a change from doing the TV documentaries he was working in. So we met up at the pub near to me in Surrey, and over a pint discussed an idea he'd had, which was to make a film about a Spitfire, a particular Spitfire, and a guy who owned it. And we were chatting, and he said, "Do you think there'd be any interest in a feature doc about about the Spitfire?" And I said, "Absolutely." And I felt that really was the case, because I tried to make one before, but focused more on the pilots than the aeroplane. And it didn't come to anything. But even then, it struck me that there's a great story here. So when Ant said that, I thought, yeah, let's do this. And so we had a few discussions over the next couple of days, and we just decided that we were going to do it. The most difficult thing about making independent cinema is raising the money. And we felt that there was a really key part of this film that we needed to shoot straight away before we even raised any budget, and that was the interviews with the pilots who'd flown the aircraft during the Second World War. And so we just started, and we recruited a couple of friends to shoot it, and we just went on a little tour of the country and interviewed these pilots who we'd been introduced to through different agencies. And that was essentially how the thing started. We just got these interviews in the can, as we say. We did a lot of research, very detailed research on them, and then wrote up our questions, and then went to see them. And it's quite incredible how they just opened up and told us, what it was like to fly the airplanes, during the war, and their feelings about it. And so it was an incredible privilege to do that. But that's what became the basis of the film, and from that point on, we were then able to raise the finance to make the rest of the film.
Understand. Well, I mean, that definitely must have been an incredible journey, especially if you're doing a road trip of sorts to meet various pilots over the course of their history and get their stories. As this year is the 85th anniversary of the Spitfire, we wanted to share that story. Of course, you published the documentary a couple of years ago, but in light of that, we wanted to also honor the men, the women, everyone that worked on such an important aircraft in history. And I'll actually give you a sneak peek as well. So this is the timepiece that we're doing. It's got a couple unique items and features on it. We've got a little emblem on the back as well, which will of course be sending one over your way. But we've just decided that there didn't seem to be much noise this year about the anniversary, and we wanted to make sure that was a highlight of this year, especially being the 85th anniversary. So the next thing I wanted to speak about was, you mentioned the journey about speaking and interviewing the pilots, but you had a lot of aerial footage as well. It must have been quite challenging to get that type of footage. So how was that process? I mean, of course, a lot of moving parts, but could you share a little bit more about that experience? And of course, the slight follow-up to that would be, did you get a chance to fly one on your own?
Well, I can answer that question from the off. No. Everyone asks me that, and no, I never got the chance to fly in it. We gave our exec producer the one flight that was offered in the two-seater Spitfire, so he got that. Yes, challenging is also the right word to describe how we pieced that together. We knew that we wanted to film with real aircraft, not with CGI or models or anything like that. We knew we had to do something special. And I was looking for footage that might be suitable. We wondered if there was some library footage, that people had shot previously. And there wasn't really anything that stood out until I stumbled across a website for, I think it was Sotheby's actually, and they had a whole piece on there about a Mark I Spitfire that they were going to auction, and they had video footage on there shot by a guy called John Dibbs. And I knew of John Dibbs as a photographer because my father, who's also very keen on aviation, had one of his calendars that he publishes every year with these beautiful pictures on. And so I didn't realize that he also did moving footage. And so I showed this to my colleagues, and everyone thought the footage was a head and shoulders above everything else. And so we'd already started working, trying to put together a trailer or a teaser trailer for the film, like 3-minute piece. Not like the kind of thing you'd see in the cinema, but much more the kind of thing where we could show people what our approach to the film would be, why it would be different from the countless other, Spitfire documentaries out there. And so I sent this to John, and he got back to me and said, I'm really interested. Shall we meet up? Now, the problem was he's based in Seattle. Although he's a Brit, he's based in Seattle and I'm based in the UK. So we had to wait several months until he was due to come over on work. And we met up and discussed the project, and he agreed to shoot it for us. But the next big obstacle was that this stuff doesn't come free. Spitfires are very expensive to fly, £3,500 an hour. And we wanted a selection of them. We didn't just want one. We wanted to show the development from the obviously the prototype doesn't exist anymore, but the Mark I right up to the later Marks. And so we gave him a list of aeroplanes that we wanted. We wanted a Mark I, and then a Mark V, and a Mark IX, and a Mark XIV. They seemed to be the biggest steps in the development. And he said, "Oh, I can get you a Mark VIII." I said, "We didn't ask for a Mark VIII."
Yeah.
But as it turned out, there's a funny thing about when you're doing any project, really, not just a film, but how you kind of get what you. It's like the Rolling Stones song. It's like the Rolling Stones song. You don't necessarily get what you want, but you do get what you need. And that Mark VIII turned out to be absolutely key to the story of the film, because as it happened, we had already interviewed a couple of women who had flown Spitfires during the war as what were called ferry pilots. They'd fly them from the factories to the airfields. And one of them, Mary Ellis, had told this story about how one day she had actually signed the inside of a Spitfire in the hope that some brave young pilot would see her name and look her up. And as it turned out, the aircraft she signed was that very Mark VIII. And so if you've seen the film, at the end of the film, we reunite her with that Spitfire, and it makes for an incredibly powerful ending, because all the way through the film you've learnt about the aeroplane, you've learnt about the pilots, and then here's a sequence at the end of the film where we combine the person with the plane, and it becomes a very powerful kind of metaphor for the end of the film about this aeroplane, about what it stood for, and about the people who flew it.
Isn't it? Spitfire.
So that was the kind of thing that he brought to the project, above and beyond being a brilliant aerial photographer. And then we had to raise the additional funds. So the exec producer I talked about earlier, who got the flight in the in the two-seater. So that exec producer, whose name was Steve Milne, agreed to put quite a substantial amount of money into the film, and that allowed us to do our first aerial shoot at an old, well, it's no longer an RAF airfield, but a place called RAF Bicester, and it still has the wartime style grass airfield, so it doesn't have concrete runways like airfields do now. It's just a grass airfield. And so we with Dibsy's help, we got 3 Mark 1 Spitfires, and we arranged for those to come in. We had a helicopter, we had a fixed wing shooting platform, and this day happened in I think it was 2016. And it was quite late in the year in September, when the weather can be changeable, but also what that means is you're taking a risk, but you get much more beautiful clouds and what have you. And as it happened, when that day dawned, there was like a weather window above the part of the country where we were, and we got this absolutely incredible footage of these 3 Mark 1 aircraft. Both above the airfield and then also on what's called a transit to another airfield where we were going to film the next day, and that became the heart of the film in terms of the visual imagery, because you really, through that aerial photography, you get to see the beauty and the majesty of the airplane itself, and it's, you realise why it's become so iconic amongst aviation enthusiasts across the world, because it really is a very, very beautiful aircraft, even though it's a war machine.
Thanks for sharing that. I mean, it's funny because I intended for this sort of recording to be more of a casual conversation, and I had in my head I had a few questions lined up, and I also, of course, shared with you what things I may ask, but I think you answered 2 or 3 questions on the spot already. Because I know obviously you had Mary Ellis. That's an incredibly powerful story. I even read up on that when I was much younger, and I think you had Charles Dance, who was the narrator on the film. So there's a lot of these personnel that obviously it seems like, despite the challenges early on with needing to get interviews done, footage, you've pretty much passed with flying colors. So I wanted to ask as well, outside of these things you're picking up, what were the main, I would say, challenges to really finalizing this? Was it to get that key person to make that contact with former pilots? Was it, that executive in your team that was able to sort of put that funding through? What were the parts where you're like, oh man, this is something that we really need to hope something pulls through, or it's not going to work?
Well, filmmaking's a funny business, especially when you're trying to pull something together from nothing. We didn't have any infrastructure around us. It was just Ant and I to begin with, as we were the team, and then bit by bit other people came in. But it was still essentially just this small. It was pretty much a small team. I mean, probably in total about 8 to 10 people as what became the core team, with other producers and cameramen and what have you. And the challenge is always to, it's the money is the thing that always underlies it, because you no bucks, no Buck Rogers. You just can't you can't get off the ground unless you've got that funding, and so it's always trying to make everything work, and then you're trying to find these connections, as you say. How do we get to this veteran? How do we get to that veteran? Well, once we've done 1 or 2 interviews, then word gets around that community. Oh, these guys are the real deal. They know what they're talking about. It's not just another TV program where you say, tell me what you did in the war. We would say to them, well, tell us what you did on September the 6th, 1940, because in your logbook it says, and they knew we'd done our research. And so things like that really helped open doors. And then having, John Dibbs led us to a guy called Phil O'Dell, who's Rolls-Royce's chief test pilot, and he really helped. So it's that series of connections that you show you're not you're not cowboys or anything like that. You're
Yep.
not fly-by-nights. You are people who are seriously setting out to tell this story in a different way. When for 3 years running, we went. There's a big air display that happens in the UK called Flying Legends. It stopped because of COVID, but it's been going on for 20 years. And so it was the biggest. It's actually the biggest vintage warbirds display in the whole of Europe. And so we knew that was a really key thing to go to. So we would lodge in the corner of Dibsy's tent or marquee, and we'd bring a big screen and we'd cut these teaser trailers and we'd show them to people, and they'd be wearing headphones, silent disco headphones, because there's one thing about an air display is they're noisy. And
Yep.
so by having these headphones in, people could immerse themselves in looking at these 3 or 4 minute trailers. And I remember one guy sticking his head into the tent and saying, what's this then? We said, oh, it's a new film about the Spitfire. He said, I've seen them all. I said, you haven't seen one like this? He said, no, right. And he came in and he put the headphones in, we pressed play, and it literally his mouth dropped. And he showed us his arm, and his hairs were all standing up on his arm. And afterwards he took the headphones off and he said, you're right, it was different. And it's often hard to work out, well, perhaps why, or it's hard to convince somebody why it's going to be different. We knew that we wanted it to be different, but part of it is the magic of the imagery. But a huge part of it is also it's getting those veterans to tell you their stories in an emotional way. So not in the kind of nuts and bolts way. I did this, I did that, but it's to tell you more about what they really felt. There's one of our pilots flew in Malta, and he told us about the taste of fear, because you don't often hear the veterans talk about how scary it was, how terrifying it was. I mean, these guys were only 20, 21, something like that. And he talked about how you would just sweat in an involuntary way, and it would trickle down your face, and you would taste it, and it's salty. And he said that is the taste of fear. You can't stop it. It's not because you're hot. Mm-hmm. It just comes out. Your body's telling you this is a really scary experience for there's somebody on your tail trying to kill you. So it's things like that. Just I think elevated it into a different place. And then we knew we wanted to tell the whole story. But one of our little jokes was, well, if you want to know how many rivets there are in a Spitfire, read a book. But if you want to know what it was like to fly in combat, watch the film. And so we had this narrative that took us through from the early days of the, before the Spitfire with the Schneider Trophy seaplanes, right through till its retirement. And quite a few people said, well, why on earth did the RAF stop flying Spitfires? Well, technology and progress, it just moves on. And at the moment the jet engine was invented, that spelt the end of piston engine fighters. And no matter how good the Spitfire was, there's no way it could compete with a jet engine. And so that was the end of that. And that's so all that. There were lots of challenges in making the film, from what story to tell, to how do we raise the funding, how do we get access to the veterans, how on earth do we film the number of Spitfires that we want to get, all these things. But bit by bit, it gradually just falls into place, and then suddenly you find yourself at the premiere on the red carpet, and you think, how on earth did we get here?
How do you get there?
But you do.
Well, that's actually pretty amazing. I mean, I've watched as well. I see behind you Mission Control, so I watched that as well years ago. So yeah, I have. I mean, I obviously, no offense, but I never paid much attention to who had produced or directed these documentaries. But the style that you have for the, I guess, documentaries is definitely a little bit different. And one thing I felt was different, which I think you may have received this type of question a lot, and you've also touched on it on this recording as well, but the style that you've filmed in, or how you've been able to evoke responses from those pilots you interviewed, and just the filming style, I think that shows a very different side of what was the truth and what happened back in the day. So I think the ability that you were able to capture this type of a feeling and emotion was remarkable. So I just wanted to share that with you, that I thought it was quite incredible to get that side of events, especially from these pilots from before. I guess one of my last questions would be, given that's the 85th anniversary of the Spitfire, it's been a few years since this documentary of yours came out, and obviously throughout the UK and maybe in Europe itself, the Spitfire is such an icon, and some may view it as a hero in their eyes. But is there anything you can share in particular, what you feel like was so compelling to make this have its own documentary? You know, why the Spitfire, and what makes it so special?
Well, it is that iconic status. Now, I was brought up, I mentioned my dad earlier. I was brought up in a house where he was a great supporter of the underdog. You know, his football team is an underdog football team, and the aeroplane.
Which team is that?
Tottenham Hotspur.
Okay.
Yeah.
Of course.
And you know, they're always there, but they're never quite. You know, very rarely at the top. And my dad always, growing up, because he grew up during the war, his favourite plane was not the Spitfire, it was the Hurricane. And so I grew up always being told that, you know, the Hurricane was a great plane in its own right, and etc. etc. But you know, and of course, that gives you a certain outlook on life where you realise that it's not always the thing that's most lauded, which is the best. However, when you look at the Spitfire, you realise that it is a really, really beautiful aeroplane, but it was also a very effective warplane. And there was a reason why the Spitfire went on to become the primary RAF fighter, and the Hurricane didn't, because the Hurricane was the end of a long line of development from biplanes in the 30s. And it reached a point where it couldn't really be developed anymore, whereas the Spitfire represented something new. It came from these racing planes. It was all metal, which the Hurricane wasn't. And it was just sleeker and was capable of more development. And that was proved by the way that the engine kept being improved, the Merlin engine. And then it was the aeroplane again was transformed with the Griffin engine, which was, you know, half as powerful again almost as the Merlin, and yet the airframe could withstand it. Now, ultimately, as one of the interviewees says in the film, Tom Neal, he says, you know, by the end of the war, the combination of the airframe and this incredibly powerful engine was almost too much for it. And he said, we pleaded with Supermarine to make something else because it was just so, you know, it was by that stage overpowered. And but nevertheless still a capable aeroplane. So I think the reason why the Spitfire, it has this iconic status because of its beauty, because of what it did. And it also, you know, there's another aspect as well, is the Hurricane never had a film made about it. The Spitfire did. It was called First of the Few, and it was made in the wartime years, and it was a propaganda piece. But I think that's cemented in the public's imagination, both in the UK and across the world, that here was something special. And so it kind of had cheerleaders for it, and those cheerleaders, I think, have kept the idea of the Spitfire and what it stood for and its capabilities, if you like, in the front, well, essentially in people's DNA, in their memories, more than the other aeroplanes, more than the Hurricane, more than the Typhoon, more than the Tempest. It was the Spitfire, and the Spitfire represents something really special about aviation, but it also stands for freedom, and because, you know, the Second World War was about freedom. It was about defending freedom and winning the freedom back from the oppressed peoples of Europe, but also, you know, in the Far East, in the war against Japan as well. You know, Spitfires flew out there too. So I think it represents something really special, both in aviation history and also in world history. Because without the Spitfire, it's possible that the Hurricanes could have won the Battle of Britain, but unlikely, I'd have said. Mm-hmm. So in some respects, you could say that the Spitfire was the plane that saved the world, which is the subtitle of when it's on Netflix. And I know people think that's a rather cheeky claim, but without it, Had the Nazis won, or had the Japanese Empire spread right across Asia, we could be in a very different world today. So I think that there are a number of reasons why the Spitfire is so significant and important, and that's what we wanted to make the film about.
Awesome. Well, that's a great response. I appreciate that. In terms of the Spitfire, the documentary, I've wrapped up, I think, most of the things I wanted to ask. If you'd like to share anything more, that would be great. Otherwise, I know you're working on something else in the background. It's another documentary coming up. If you'd like to share a little bit about that, that would be great. If we can let our audience know as well.
Okay, well, two things. The first thing is, I know you have a watch out that commemorates Eric Locke, the diminutive Eric Locke, who was a fighter pilot, Spitfire pilot during the war. And funnily enough, he came up because he died during the war. But he came up in one of the interviews with one of our pilots, Tom Neal, who during the Battle of Britain flew a Hurricane, and he got involved in a combat where he and a Spitfire were chasing an enemy bomber, I think it was, out to sea, and eventually they shot the thing down. And between the two of them, so perfect example of how teamwork between pilots in two different aircraft, and they flew back to their respective bases, and Tom didn't think any more of it, and then he was contacted by the RAF senior commanders and told that he had shared a kill with Eric Locke, who was the pilot of the Spitfire. And in the end, they went up and they were interviewed for the BBC. Unfortunately, that's been lost. But I thought that was an interesting little thing because he's not a pilot that many people know about, but he was an extremely effective fighter pilot who had he lived longer, would have probably racked up a very impressive tally of enemy aircraft shot down. So I think it's lovely that you've created this watch, this timepiece, that commemorates him, because he's an unsung hero of the wartime years and of the RAF. Yeah. And it's nice that his name lives on. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. I'll share that with the team as well.
Yeah, do. And then so the other film that we're working on at the moment is, if you like, the sequel to Spitfire, and it's called Lancaster. And the Lancaster bomber was probably, it was definitely one of the most effective bombing aircraft of the Second World War. I would say, if you wanted to compare it, the American B-17 Flying Fortress, of course, has been the hero of countless films and what have you. But as a bomber aircraft, it was quite poor in comparison to the Lancaster. So I would say if you wanted the two best bombers of the Second World War, you'd say the Lancaster and then the B-29 Super Fortress. But for us, it felt like a natural film to make next. It felt like a natural film to make next, because of that. It's iconic in its own way, but not in a beautiful way. The Spitfire has this beauty that transcends people's interest in aviation and military history and all the rest of it. The Lancaster is a much more pugnacious looking airplane, and of course it does something which is much more difficult to, if you like, justify isn't maybe the right word, but to interest people in, because the Spitfire is all about the defense of freedom, and that's an easy thing to sell. And when we look back at how when we made Spitfire, the story now, looking back, seems like an easy story to tell, but the Lancaster story is about the really difficult thing of winning a war. What you have to do to win a war, and that is a much more difficult and still controversial subject. And because to win a war, you've got to do things that perhaps in peacetime you don't like to think about. But in the wartime years, and with the technology of the time, all they could do to take the war to the enemy was bomb the enemy, and the airplanes and the bomb sites and the navigation systems weren't good enough to allow them to drop a bomb at night, which is how they had to do it, because they couldn't fly during the day because the enemy defenses were too strong. So, how do you drop a bomb on a factory in the middle of a city without hitting other people? And that was the challenge for the air crews of Bomber Command during the war. And the aeroplanes they flew were just not up to it until the Lancaster came along. And so our story is about that airplane and the crews who flew them and the really difficult challenges they had to face. Not just the fact that they, to go to Berlin and back was an 8-hour flight, but the enemy defences were so strong, and certainly by 1943, 1944, they were lethally strong. How could they square this idea of what they were being asked to do with the reality when they could see a burning city below them? So we asked them to do so much in our names. And the tragedy of the story is that at the end of the war, people's backs were literally turned on them, the politicians' backs, and to some extent the public as well. And it took them 70 years to get a memorial built to Bomber Command and the air crews. So there's a real double story in this film, not just about the aeroplane, but about the air crews, the 7 airmen who flew in those airplanes, and then how they were treated at the end of the war. So there's, as a film, it's quite amazing. It's got darkness, it's got light, it's got controversy, it's got redemption, all the things that a filmmaker loved. So, we're just in the final stages of it. So,
and it's non-fiction and it's educational. So,
yeah,
you're not losing out.
Yeah. So there's a new set of challenges about that one. So maybe we'll do another interview in the future about that.
Definitely. I think that would be very, very nice. Well, David, unless you have anything to share, I really, really appreciate your time. I think these are the types of conversations we want to have, especially for myself personally. I've been in love with aviation since I was a kid. I was digging up my old parents' boxes of things that this drawings I did when I was a kid. And I had all these fighter jets and, of course, I had dinosaurs, orcas, but it was a lot of fighter jets. Yeah. So it's come full circle. Of course, working for a brand such as Aviate, where we try to go a little bit deeper, not to just brush over the surface, especially since we are privileged, 100% privileged, to be able to share these stories through pieces of timekeeping machinery. So we're also trying to be as respectful as possible for those people that have spent their lives, fighting for the countries that they're from, and of course all the stories that they come with. So, thanks again, David. I really appreciate your time, and we'll be in touch soon again.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about it. So,
appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again, David. Take care.
Okay.
Have a good one.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We're talking about total war. There's nobody else helping us. All the continent have fallen down, and it was us against this monster. The Spitfire was built as an interceptor fighter.
These aeroplanes represent to the British people an unwillingness to be bullied.
The country couldn't possibly have too many of these fighters.
It was a design which was brilliant. You can't fly a Spitfire and forget about it. It stays with you forever.
Enemy aircraft were falling like confetti. We were cock-a-hoop.
You had to be very careful in landing. She was a lady in the air, but a bitch on the ground.
I looked up, and the air was filled with Germans. Had they landed, they'd have won, and the course of world history would have been changed.
You've got to always remember those who didn't come back.
This aeroplane stands for so much. Grace and gallantry. She is a symbol of freedom.